Hello, everyone. You are watching the Asian American Herald, a new media network for and about Asian Americans in the capital region of New York. This show is being aired via live stream on Facebook, and a recording will be available afterwards at our Facebook page, Asian American Herald of the Capital District. My name is Himani Gupta Carlson, and I am a local farmer, writer, and professor at Empire State College in Saratoga Springs. So tonight, we're going to continue the conversation that we started last week on anti-Asian discrimination in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and some ways that scholars are considering how to build curricula centered on an anti-racism focus. My guest is one of my great friends and colleagues from Empire State College, Dr. Rihanna Rogers. So Dr. Rogers is an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies with a focus on history and anthropology. She is also a presidential fellow with the Rockefeller Institute and principal investigator for an initiative she created several years back known as the Buffalo Project. So Rihanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the time.
It's very great to see you after a year of being a little bit absent from the college.
Yes.
So Empire State College is actually a part of the State University of New York, or SUNY, but it's unique in a number of ways. One of which is the fact that it has locations all over the state. So I'm here in Saratoga on the east side of the state, and Rihanna actually is in Buffalo. And as we know, New York has really weathered an incredible storm over these past few months, first with the pandemic and more recently with all of the protests and responses to the killing of George Floyd that we have been seeing over the past week. So past month. So before we begin, I'd actually like you, Rihanna, to just tell us a little bit about the community you live in and the impacts that you felt from the pandemic and the protests and other responses that have been occurring as a result of the Black Lives Matter activism. Please begin.
Sure. So in order to frame really my take on events right now, I'll just give you a little bit of background of my research. So Hermione mentioned to you about the Buffalo Project. This project has been going on formally as a study since 2011, and it informally began in 2010. So I have about 10 years of data working with various community organizations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ways of thinking about community through either an academic lens or an activist lens. I would call myself an anthropological activist many times, where I collect data with the purpose to use it to make and enact change. So with that frame being in mind, I really like to make sure that my programming is responsive. So I like to have my ear to the ground. I have a lot of community partners who I talk to. And so I'm going to give you this as an example of the backdrop of COVID. So as you know, many institutions across SUNY were not prepared to deal with transitioning online or what it meant to move online. Now, what's unique about Empire State College is we've been doing online learning for, over 25 years now. And we have a really interesting model in that, we have individuals who have coursework that they might do in person, one-on-one in study groups, or they could do their work 100% online. Both Hermione and I have kind of navigated those worlds. When I first met Hermione, she was teaching mostly online. And when she first met me, I was teaching mostly in person. So that has been interesting about helping in COVID, number one. When we transitioned online at SUNY Empire State College, we had an infrastructure to help our students transition. And that was really great. But we also found out that other partners institutions didn't. So I do a lot of work with UB, with Buff State, with ECC, and they were struggling. And a lot of our K-12 partners were struggling as well. So one of the first things that I did, besides being a fellow at the Rockefeller Institute of Government, I'm also a fellow in SUNY dealing with educational innovations. And so my work doubled because I had to start doing SUNY developed a remote teaching clinic, and I was hosting, 5 or 6 sessions about how to actually transition our colleagues online. That was really difficult. I was helping out locally in K-12 in Western New York to do the same. So that's the technology piece. Now I'm going to say about the culture piece. What's been really difficult, if you don't know about Western New York, Western New York is in the top 10 most segregated cities in the country. Now, I want you to also know New York fits into that top 10 category, so it's not to exclude. But because of the formation of New York State, which a lot of my research in the Buffalo Project focuses on, you have these segregated pockets of communities, some that have wealth, some that are along sociolinguistic, socioeconomic lines. And what we started to notice, even in Buffalo, which we've talked about racialized disparities that we've heard during COVID-19, we started to clearly see that in Western New York. So we have a revitalization process that's been going on in Western New York for quite a few years. And part of the city that has not seen a lot of revitalization has been the East Side. So the East Side of Buffalo is predominantly underprivileged peoples. And I'm going to use that term broadly. Because it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could be linguistics, it could be immigrant status, it could be a variety of reasons that make them marginalized. But a lot of money had not been funded into the revitalization of that part of the town. And so what you have to understand about this is Buffalo is a $1.2 million person city, and about 50% of it constitutes the East Side. So just think about that. 50% of the population was directly already impacted from lack of opportunity, and then COVID hit. And then that lack of opportunity has just been showcased, right? Where you're seeing individuals who may not have access to computers before, but now all of your work has gone online, and you don't have a computer, you don't have a cell phone in your home. So, these things started becoming really apparent really fast. And one of the things that I had hoped to do kind of coming into action with the Buffalo Project, because I already knew that these layers existed from my research, was what were ways that we could immediately help. So instantly, some colleagues of mine, Shauna Lodgson and Ashley Mason at Empire State College, working with a student, Buffalo Project RA, Sammy Maitland, we kind of came up with this idea of how do we bring people together? And we were like, well, we have Zoom. So I use Zoom a lot. And we had all these online technologies, and we said, why don't we create a platform that can help with mental health issues, that could help with physical activity issues if people are in their house? And we started trying to have these conversations, and we ultimately built a programming that exists at Empire that literally is just COVID old, called SUNY Empire Connects. And in the matter of the last 14 weeks, we have hosted 25 diverse sessions each week, and we're seeing about 50 to 250 people attending these sessions, students and otherwise. We've been talking about these disparities there. So that's been a great space for that. And using something like Zoom, where it's not behind a firewall, it's open access. You could get it on your smartphone if that's all you have. It's actually been allowing us to reach some of these disparate communities that are in Buffalo that may not have been able to come to Cheektowaga, which is where our campus is, because they couldn't get there by the bus. But now they could use their cell phone and use Zoom, and then they could come into these conversations. That's been really interesting in this COVID era, is the community building, I would say.
That's really cool. And actually what I kind of remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that even the genesis of the Buffalo Project was you being new to Buffalo, having moved up from Florida in 2010, and using Yahoo meetup groups to try to start to find your way around the community. And that was kind of those were the bones that began the Buffalo Project, which it's very interesting to see the community building that's kind of been built up from that.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I actually recently said this in a presentation I gave a few weeks ago around my feelings of being in a racialized pandemic. And I highlighted this about when I moved to Buffalo, New York, I had just moved from, I'm originally from Los Angeles, which is a large metropolis, right? And when I was living in South Florida, I was living near Fort Lauderdale, Miami, large metropolises. This was the first time that I had ever moved to an environment that wasn't a multiracial, multilingual metropolis, which is where I've always been. Buffalo is multiracial and multilingual, but it's segregated. So you actually see people who are from a particular racial and ethnic and sociolinguistic background living in one neighborhood versus another. I'll give that as an example across the state. It's like saying New York City had Little Italy because it used to be just Italian people, right? But today it's not. It's now been mixed. Buffalo didn't see that gentrification processing happening until for the last 5 years. So when I moved here, I went through a crazy culture shock. You know, as a multiracial woman whose parents are not the same color, I grew up in a household that was integrated. And so for me to move to an environment that wasn't, where you wouldn't see people who looked different from each other living in the same neighborhood, it was weird to me as a person. And so that's actually how the Buffalo Project started. I wanted to understand why Buffalo operated the way that it did. I wanted to get people's stories about what makes neighborhoods so important. Why are people living in these separate places? Is it good? Is it bad? What's helped? What's not? And that's actually where it came from, and it's grown from that point since.
Yeah, that's very cool, and it's very interesting to kind of just track how it's grown. I think a lot of community building really does begin with those simple ideas. And for listeners and viewers out there, I would kind of encourage you to check out the Buffalo Project and see what Rihanna has built. So I want to move now to a recent statement that has generated a fair amount of dialogue. SUNY's Black Faculty and Staff Collective have actually issued a letter to the chancellor that demands significant curricula and institutional changes. And I actually just want to read a little bit of the letter. This letter is fairly available online via Twitter, via Facebook. It's very much a public document. So the letter states in part, recent national protests around the murder of George Floyd, the tragic death of SUNY Dutchess Community College student Maurice Gordon, and the multitude of lives of Black women and men lost must be made central to our academic and administrative labor. We are writing to demand that SUNY take immediate and meaningful action to deconstruct the present system and rebuild an academic space that is rooted in anti-racist ideology. As Angela Davis astutely noted, it's not enough anymore to not be racist. We all must be anti-racist. So I really want to hone in on Angela Davis's quote. It's not enough to not be racist. We all must be anti-racist. So what is an anti-racist ideology? And what does being anti-racist mean from your perspective, Rihanna?
I think that's a great question. And it actually is something that's really on my mind right now because as part of the Buffalo Project, we just developed for spring 2021 an anti-racism virtual residency. And so let me kind of explain my definition and I'll transition into that. But anti-racism has a variety of terms and associated with it. You know, I don't actually like the generic definition that you'll usually find online, which says that it's somebody who actively works against racism and builds tolerance. I don't like the word tolerance, and I'm going to tell you why. Nobody wants to be tolerated, if you really think about that word. People want to be accepted. People want to be considered equals. People want an equitable voice in a conversation and dialogue at the table. And so for me, anti-racism is taking a step further beyond that term. It's not only understanding, so I'm going to take a step back and saying understanding that racism exists. I have been engaged in conversations recently where, you know, individuals who are less informed about things have argued that anti-racism or racism doesn't even exist. Like I've heard that post-racialized comments yesterday. And so I would say for me, it's like taking that step back and being reflective first and saying, okay, do I understand what racism is? In order for me to be able to be anti-racist, I have to acknowledge that racism exists. I have to understand that racism is systematized and institutionalized and can be something that is done intentional or unintentional. It could have gravity that's negative or positive in the sense of you might just be ignorant, you might just lack knowledge, and you might do something that is racist, but you don't actually mean to because you lack the knowledge. It could be a variety of things. So what I would say first is you have to deconstruct racism. Then you can move into being anti-racist. Then you have the ability and the skill set that academic conversation we always talk about. You have the understanding to say, okay, so this is what racism is. These are the scholars who've actually understood it. These are the conversations that exist in this world. Now, how do I deconstruct the racism in order to create anti-racist programming, anti-racist action? What I always get fumbled up on in this movement of anti-racism is that we're not starting in the right place. We're making the assumption that individuals already know what that term racism means to get to a more advanced term of anti-racism. And so if we transition a little bit to the Buffalo Project, that's actually the start of how we're doing that residency. We have this 3-week exchange where what we're doing is we're making sure people understand what racism is first. Then we're transitioning into how do you see what anti-racism is by looking at some case studies. And then by that 3rd week of that joint experience, okay, what do you do from here? How do you actually partake in anti-racist activity?
Okay, that's very good. This is a question that could take 3 weeks in a residency to actually get to the answer, and I'm going to give you like 2 minutes. But racism. How do you know that you know what racism is? Or how does one know?
That could be a book. I think what's difficult is you have to have an understanding that people have different lived experiences. And in different contexts in which you reside, racism can be different things. If you've been in a privileged environment and you may experience one ignorant statement, that might be the biggest statement that you've ever experienced, and it could dominate your world for the next 25 years. But if you're a person who's been involved in systematic racism and you have regularly, transgenerationally faced historical trauma, there's a more complex form of racism that emerges from that transgenerational, historic, and ongoing traumas. And so it's not a word that exists by itself. I mean, it needs context. You need to be able to say, okay, and that's how I turn it back to you, Jaime. What would be your context? Because your context of racism is going to be different than my context of racism based on your academic training versus my academic training and your lived experience versus my lived experience. And I think that's where we have to start with people. If you can actually give voice to the individuality of human experience and let them start there, that's how you gain buy-in for having broader conversations about things that are difficult, like race.
Yeah. And for me, it's a very much of a felt thing. Like you, Rihanna, I'm privileged in the sense that I'm very highly educated. I have a secure position as an associate professor. I'm tenured, and I am financially fairly secure. So I'm in a good space in that sense. And in that way, I can actually move through the world pretty easily on some days and forget that I'm living in a white supremacist society. And then something happens, and it slaps me in the face. There's this reality that my world is very much conditioned by the strictures of white privilege and what that has enabled for certain people and disempowered for other people. And, I'm continuously curious about how to get past that conversation, because when it hits me so hard because I've been hurt or because I've been let down or because somebody has said something, I find it very difficult to go to that person and have that conversation. I find it easier to kind of look for my allies. But I feel like you almost have to step across the line in order to have that real conversation.
Yeah. One of the things, we just recently had a presidential town hall on racial justice, which I co-moderated with a colleague of ours, Dr. David Fullard. And one of the things that I've been stressing, because I also have a session that I've been hosting on African American experience and Black culture, like a discussion group for allies and, people that are of Black and brown backgrounds. And the term that I think is important that I've been moving to and away from safe spaces is brave spaces. It takes a lot of bravery to be able to talk to somebody about your lived experience and to make yourself vulnerable. And if we're ever going to improve as a country, we have to be able to be brave on all sides of this equation, whether it be a person who may have had or continues to have racist ideologies. If they get into a conversation with somebody, they're going to have that space given by people who are anti-racist to be able to talk about that, and vice versa. I think the biggest thing that I've been challenging, so another major project that comes out of the Buffalo Project are deliberative conversations. And this grew out of political science. The Rockefeller Institute just recently published the Buffalo Project Student Interpretation of Deliberative Conversations. So I'd recommend checking out that publication. But basically, deliberative conversations, you look at a difficult topic, you provide resources that talk about, the conservative, moderate, and liberal before you enter into that dialogue, like a flipped classroom. And then you intentionally invite individuals that actually are representative of all these different sides. But the goal is that framing that conversation, you actually say, in the case of Empire, I'll usually start by saying, we're all Empire State College, part of this community, no matter our perspectives. So the goal isn't to say which perspective is right or wrong. The goal is, how do we make Empire State College better as a joint community? What are some common grounds that no matter where we fit on this spectrum, that we can work together to make our institution better? That, to me, is the best way to be anti-racist. It's finding that middle ground that we can pull people together.
Yeah, that search for commonality. I really like that phrase, brave space. It actually reminds me of my understanding of the cipher in hip hop. The cipher is this circle of bodies that is actually there to protect the performer or the speaker or whoever is in the middle of that circle, so that person can express, self-express, speak their truth. And that kind of puts a lot of pressure on the person because they are protected, but they also are expected to really, really say what's on their mind, and then to listen respectfully when the next person steps into the cipher. So I like that term a lot, and I'm looking forward to looking at it, exploring it more deeply. So I want to just ask a little bit more about the virtual residency. First off, I'll try to kind of explain what a residency at Empire State College looks like, and then I'll ask you to fill in some details. But essentially, there are a number of classes that are already in the Empire State College course catalog, or they're new creations by various faculty members that will be part of this, what's called a virtual residency in spring 2021. The classes will occur kind of for the most of the semester as individual, separate, discrete classes where a professor and students meet regularly in some way or the other, do work, have conversations, and whatnot. And then there's a period that's 3 weeks long in this case, where all the participants in the residency will come together and they will converse with each other. And then at the end of that 3-week period, they'll go back again to their discrete spaces. So I wonder, what does anti-racism curricula look like in these different kinds of courses? And I do know that one of my courses is actually part of the residency, even though I myself will not be teaching it. It's one that it's a course that's very close to my heart. And so I'm also asking you these questions because I might want to adapt the curricula a little bit.
Sure. So I think you did an excellent summary of what happens. Basically, what you see in virtual residencies is a combination of international education. So we have partnerships in 7 different countries internationally. And so faculty that are part of Empire State College, we have a course that's a Prague course. We have a course that's a Lebanon course that have also been linked to the anti-racism residency. We have a couple students from our Dominican Republic partnerships that are going to be in the residency as well. And so basically what you have is undergrad, grad, and international education courses that get populated into our learning management system, which is Moodle. So for that 3-week period, everybody, all professors, all students go into a universal space, and they're going to be learning about the topic anti-racism. So here's the thing that we're developing right now, and this is one of the reasons I really like virtual residencies. It goes back to the Buffalo Project model. All of the faculty that are involved get to have a voice on saying what they want to see within the virtual residency content. And so right now, I am running a team of individuals working with the Racialized Faculty Caucus, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, and members of the Presidential Diversity Task Force, where I'm asking all of these representative bodies to say, what kind of materials do you want to make sure that we highlight? And then we're structuring it in that model that I just mentioned to you, where it's going from what is racism? And we're going to pull in some case studies. So I'm actually reaching out to colleagues to get those. Then we're developing questions like, based on the review of the case studies, what does racism look like in the United States? What does racism look like in Lebanon? What does racism look like in Prague? And so their students are also contributing knowledge based on their own experiences. Or questions like, have you ever experienced or understand what racism is? Or have you ever seen racism occur in your life? Sharing those types of things. We're also planning on to pull in some Harvard implicit association tests. So kind of getting a barometer of where people are with their implicit biases. I've collected in the Buffalo Project over the years quite a few OERs that I've developed with colleagues, including one of our colleagues, Dr. Gina Torino, who did a OER a couple years ago for me on microaggressions. And so that will be in the course. So what I'm doing is it's kind of crowdsourcing, the best way I would describe it, of resources. So it's not coming from one perspective. It's coming from multiple disciplines. Students are allowed to review these materials and comment on them. And then we have a keynote that's happening as well at the same time, which will be a panelist, a group of individuals that represent different parts of the country and different countries' view on racism right now. So it's a really interdisciplinary approach. It's a really kind of, responsive, adaptive approach that we have adopted, which is really great because it's very inclusive of perspective.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely looking forward to it and participating in some form or fashion. I believe we are just about out of time. So I really wanted to thank Dr. Rihanna Rogers for being our guest tonight. And I hope that we can have you back perhaps in the spring as the virtual residency is unfolding, and we can talk maybe a little bit more about what everybody is gleaning about anti-racist ideology as that occurs. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for a very enlightening show. I'm Himani Gupta Carlson, and our guest has been Dr. Rihanna Rogers of Empire State College. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans in the Capital Region. Please send us your story ideas and look for the recording of this show on our Facebook page. Have a good evening, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Rihanna, and have a good evening too.